By early May 1945, Hitler was gone. Germany's remaining forces were surrendering across Europe, and orders went out for every U-boat in the Atlantic to cease operations and return to base. One by one, captains acknowledged the message and turned for home. For off the coast of Rhode Island, in water barely 100 feet deep, U-853 settled onto the seabed and waited. Her captain, Helmut Frömsdorf, was 24 and stood 6'10". A body that filled the conning tower and a reputation that filled the boat. Frömsdorf understood what staying at that depth meant. If destroyers came, there would be no escape. But through the periscope, the coal freighter slid into view, moving north along the coast, unaware that this stretch of water had not yet been told the war was over. In April 1944, under the command of her first-ever officer, Captain Lieutenant Helmut Sommer, Germany's latest U-boat, U-853, departed Lorient for her maiden voyage. For months, she would perform what the Navy called a weather patrol, collecting meteorological data from the North Atlantic, information that the Kriegsmarine considered essential for forecasting Allied operations and movements. For the crew, however, this meant long exposed hours on the surface, transmitting their coded reports while enemy aircraft searched overhead, ready to pounce at any given moment. As a Type 9 C-40 class, she was just over 250 feet long and had a crew of 55. Her main weapons were 6 21-inch torpedo tubes, 4 forward and 2 aft, carrying 22 torpedoes in total. On her outer deck, she mounted a 105mm gun and a pair of automatic cannons for defense against aircraft. As an emblem, her crew painted a yellow shield with a red horse on her sail. After a month patrolling the sea, on May 25th, Lookout spotted smoke on the horizon. Through the periscope, Sommer saw a massive ship racing across the Atlantic, relying on speed alone for safety. He believed it was the elusive Queen Mary, a British liner now serving as a troop ship and said to be carrying thousands of American soldiers to Britain for the invasion ahead. Knowing he had one of the most valuable targets in the Atlantic in his sights, Sommer ordered U-853 to submerge and pursue. At over 28 knots, Queen Mary's engines pulled her away from the approaching submarine within minutes. Just as U-853 surfaced in her wake, a trio of Fairey Swordfish biplanes, launched from the merchant carriers Ancillus and Empire McKendrick, bore down on her. The antiquated biplanes came in low, dropping depth charges that detonated close enough to shake the hull. Still rattled from the noise, the submarine's deck gunners opened fire, sending tracers streaking across the sky and hitting all the aircraft, forcing 2 to turn back and severely damaging another. This encounter had given away U-853's position, and now USS Croatan, an American escort carrier that had been pursuing weather boats just like her across the Atlantic, directed her 6 destroyers to intercept. For days on end, the submarine evaded the American task force in a dangerous cat-and-mouse game, where Sommer would surface just long enough to raise the antenna and transmit, then crash-die before any aircraft could arrive. Each time Croatan's destroyers closed in, the submarine slipped away, so much so that the Allied crew aboard the escort carrier nicknamed their elusive target Moby Dick. On June 17th, after 10 days of pursuit, the high-frequency direction-finding equipment aboard Croatan locked on to a weather transmission. With the signal now only 30 miles away, 2 FM-1 Wildcat fighters launched from the carrier's deck and raced toward the coordinates. U-853 was still on the surface when they arrived, her antenna extended, and the valuable transmission incomplete. The Wildcats dove, their 650 caliber machine guns opening fire simultaneously, bullets tearing through the conning tower's thin plating and raking the exposed deck. In an instant, 2 sailors were down, and another dozen were injured, some knocked flat by the impact, others crawling toward the hatch. Even Sommer himself took 28 hits from bullets and shrapnel. Still, he stayed at his post, shouting orders through the pane, refusing to go below until every wounded man had been carried through the hatch as depth charges began exploding in the water all around them. The Wildcat circled for another pass. Helmut Frömsdorf, one of the boat's junior watch officers, hit the dive alarm. The klaxon sounded through the boat, and men who could still move scrambled for the hatches. Depth charges continued to detonate as U-853 dropped, the hull groaning as water pressure climbed with every second. Frömsdorf watched the depth gauge and held the dive angle steady, knowing that if he leveled off too early, the destroyers would have them. Too late, and the pressure would crush the hull. He waited until the last possible second, then pulled back on the planes, allowing the sub to slip away into deeper water. From there, U-853 limped back to Lorient for repairs. Sommer survived his wounds, but would never return to sea. The U-boat continued on a second patrol with another captain, operating off the British Isles for 7 weeks without sighting a single convoy. By 1945, Germany was fighting for its survival. The Red Army closed in from the east. The Allies crossed the Rhine. In the Atlantic, most bases lay in ruins. Fuel ran scarce, and every mission saw fewer and fewer boats return home. In late February, command passed to none other than Helmut Frömsdorf, promoted for his courage under pressure. At 24 and standing 6 foot 10 inches tall, Frömsdorf was likely the tallest captain in the German submarine service. And though not officially a Nazi party member, he believed every word of the propaganda and remained committed to serving the fatherland, no matter how bad things turned. There was a nickname for this kind of glory-seeking commander who would sacrifice every single man in his crew for the honor of a Knight's Cross: Halsschmitzen, or sore throat. Before leaving Germany for patrol, Frömsdorf visited his former captain in the hospital. Sommer, still injured, looked at the young officer and spoke plainly. The war was finished. As he left the room, his former superior told him, quote, "Do not be frivolous with the crew. They're all good boys. Make sure you bring them home." On February 23, 1945, U-853 departed Kiel for another patrol, this time bound to the American East Coast. Before sailing, engineers had fitted her with a newly refined snorkel. This modern telescoping air intake system allowed the submarine to run her diesel engines while submerged, drawing air from just above the surface, crossing the whole Atlantic almost entirely underwater, and most importantly, far beyond the reach of Allied patrol aircraft. Though the crossing took weeks, by mid-April, U-853 had reached American waters, just off the coast of Maine, closer than most Germans had been since 1942. They could even hear Boston radio broadcasts and music clearly on the receivers. On the afternoon of April 23rd, while patrolling off Portland in Casco Bay, the hydrophone operators picked up propeller noise. Through the periscope, Frömsdorf identified USS Eagle 56, a 200-foot patrol boat towing a target raft, as part of a routine bombing exercise for Navy pilots training overhead. At 12:14 p.m., Frömsdorf gave the order, and a single G7E torpedo left its tube, its electric motor driving it through the water toward the unsuspecting patrol boat and everyone inside. The 660-pound warhead struck Eagle 56 amidships, lifting the entire midsection of the ship upward, causing a column of water and debris 300 feet high, visible for miles across the bay. Eagle 56 folded in half, bow and stern rising as the center collapsed. As 49 men went down with the ship, a destroyer arrived to pull any survivors they could find from the water, half frozen and coated in fuel oil. A week later, though 5 American sailors testified at a naval court of inquiry that they'd seen the submarine's distinctive markings, a board ruled that a boiler explosion had destroyed Eagle 56. While this decision would stand for 56 years, according to witness Loring Small, a merchant marine crewman who was present that day, quote, "The Navy didn't want it out that the Eagle was sunk by a submarine. The fellows on the deck saw a submarine, but the Navy Department said shut up." Ironically, years before, on February 28, 1942, Eagle 56 had rescued survivors from the destroyer USS Jacob Jones, the first U.S. warship sunk in the Atlantic. Now, Eagle 56 herself had become the final American warship sunk in the Atlantic theater. By early May, Berlin had fallen to the Red Army, and with Hitler gone, Germany's remaining forces were surrendering en masse all across the continent. On the 4th, Gross Admiral Karl Dönitz, now serving as Reichspräsident after Hitler took his own life, transmitted orders to all U-boat commanders to cease offensive operations at once and return to base. The message went out on multiple frequencies, repeated throughout the day and into the evening. All across the Atlantic, U-boat captains acknowledged the transmission and turned for home, ready to face the consequences. Some had already surrendered. Others were preparing to scuttle their boats rather than hand them over to the Allies. But not Frömsdorf. Whether U-853 received the order remains unknown. The submarine may have been running submerged with her antennas retracted when the transmission came through, or Frömsdorf, the sore throat, may have heard it perfectly and chose to ignore it. What is certain is that by May 5th, U-853 had taken position off Point Judith, Rhode Island, in water barely 100 feet deep, against Sternitz's standing directive to attack only from at least 200 feet deep, allowing them to dive beyond the effective range of most depth charges. Despite knowing this depth meant no escape if destroyers came looking, Frömsdorf positioned his boat there anyway and waited. 3 days earlier, the collier SS Blackpoint had departed Newport News, Virginia, her holds packed with more than 5,000 tons of coal bound for Boston. The 337-foot freighter was an aging coastal workhorse, built during the last war and now hauling fuel up the eastern seaboard in her final years. Her skipper, Captain Charles Pryor, commanded a crew that included merchant sailors and a small U.S. Navy Armed Guard detachment manning the ship's defensive guns. By then, Pryor wasn't particularly worried about enemy action. The war in Europe was over in all but name, and U-boat attacks off the American coast had become quite rare. Just past 5:30 p.m. on May 5th, Blackpoint steamed north through familiar waters, about 1.5 nautical miles from Point Judith Lighthouse. Captain Pryor had just stepped out onto the deck to smoke a well-earned cigarette when the ship lurched violently beneath his feet. A torpedo had struck Blackpoint's stern with a 660-pound warhead. The explosion was so powerful it threw debris hundreds of feet into the air like daggers, creating a shockwave rippling across the water, visible from shore. According to the skipper, quote, "That's when it hit the fan. The clock was blown off the wall, and the barometer off the bulkhead. The wheelhouse door was blown open, and I don't remember if I lit the cigarette or swallowed it. I could smell gunpowder in the air." Below deck, teenage merchant marine Howard Locke was in the fire room, shoveling coal into the boiler furnace when the lights went out and water surged around him. Running as fast as he could toward the main deck, he was stunned to see the stern section was entirely gone, and the forward section still afloat, but listing and taking on water. As he rapidly prepared to abandon ship, the terrified sailor heard a terrible sound from below, the screams of Blackpoint's mascot, a chimpanzee trapped in the flooding compartment. As Locke dove into the water, he later told a reporter, quote, "The last thing I remember was that monkey hollering." On the fantail, U.S. Navy gunner Stephen Svets was manning the 6-pound cannon when the torpedo hit directly beneath his position. The blast launched him and a quarter-ton section of the gun mount through the air in a spiraling arc. By the time he came to, he was lying on the bow section, dazed, injured, and with no memory of the explosion itself or how he landed, but alive, the only survivor from the stern. His battery mate, boatswain's mate second class Lonnie Whitson Lloyd, was not as lucky, as he went down with the aft section, becoming the last U.S. sailor lost in combat in the North Atlantic. Within minutes of the torpedo attack, just as other vessels arrived to help, Pryor ordered the crew to abandon ship. Clinging to life rafts and debris were 34 survivors, including Lloyd. 12 men were either lost instantly or were trapped below decks when the bobbing stern slipped below the surface. The SS Blackpoint foundered for about 25 minutes, then rolled over on its side and sank in Block Island Sound, about 22 miles northeast of Montauk Point on Long Island. Rather than run, U-853 slowly settled on the seafloor, apparently waiting for another opportunity to strike. By nightfall, word of the attack had reached every naval command along the eastern seaboard. Now the hunt for U-853 and the last battle in the Atlantic theater had begun. Within minutes of Blackpoint sinking, the Coast Guard station in Point Judith relayed word up the chain of command. The message reached First Naval District headquarters in Boston, then traveled south to the Navy's Eastern Sea Frontier Command in New York City. Radio operators there put out an urgent call to Task Group 67, a 4-ship hunter-killer group that had just finished escorting a convoy from Oran to New York and was now steaming north toward Boston for resupply. The task force consisted of the destroyer USS Erickson under Commander F.C. McCune, along with destroyer escorts USS Amick and USS Atherton, and the frigate USS Moberly. When the orders came through to divert to Point Judith, the ships were scattered along the Massachusetts coast, with Erickson, McCune's flagship, threading through the Cape Cod Canal, boxed in by narrow waterways, with no way to reach the scene quickly. With the flagship out of position, U.S. Coast Guard Lieutenant Commander Leslie B. Tollickson aboard Moberly assumed temporary command, and the frigate and her two sister ships pushed their engines to full speed, racing south through gathering darkness toward Point Judith, arriving around 7:20 p.m. and immediately sweeping the area with sonar, searching for any trace of the submarine that had just taken the lives of 12 men. Within the hour, Lieutenant Commander Louis Izellen aboard Atherton reported a contact, detecting something metallic resting on the bottom in 108 feet of water. Skipper Izellen ordered a run with magnetic depth charges, weapons designed to detonate when passing near large iron hulls. When one of them exploded, confirming the target was metal, he immediately followed with hedgehog motors, forward-throwing weapons that only detonated on direct contact. As more and more thunderous explosions followed, Atherton brought searchlights to bear on the now black water. Sure enough, the beams revealed what the after-action report would later describe as, quote, oil geysers, air bubbles, and considerable debris. When Erickson finally arrived and McCune resumed command, the situation remained unclear. They were sure they'd hit something metallic on the seafloor, causing it to leak oil. But Point Judith's waters held dozens of old wrecks from previous wars and peacetime accidents. Without confirmation, McCune couldn't be certain whether his ship had just destroyed U-853 or wasted ordnance on a sunken freighter. The leader then ordered Atherton to mark the location with buoys, while all four vessels widened their search grid. Just before midnight, Atherton and Moberly picked up another sonar contact 4,000 yards east of the first, still in 100 feet of water. The two ships closed in and began firing hedgehogs, the motors arcing through the darkness and plunging into the sea. Searchlights swept the surface past midnight, catching oil and debris rising from below, but the sonar showed nothing moving on the sea floor. No engine noise, no sign of life. Izellen ordered depth charges anyway. The first one detonated too close to the surface, and the blast hammered back through the water, shattering Atherton's sonar dome. She broke off with her primary sensor gone. Moberly moved in and made her run, but the shallow charges cracked her sonar equipment as well, forcing engineers to jury-rig repairs while the ship circled the silent contact. Then the sonar operators called out at once. The target was moving. U-853 was creeping along the bottom at 5 knots. Moberly tracked her as she slowed to 2 or 3 knots and dropped into 75 feet of water, and lost her. The contact faded, and the submarine was gone, slipping away into the darkness while the destroyers circled above, their sonars blind, their charges spent. Dawn broke over Point Judith on May 6th. With 3 oil slicks spreading across the surface, roughly 30 feet apart, the submarine was bleeding. At 5:30 a.m., sonar operators re-established contact, and McCune ordered the attack to resume. Atherton, Moberly, and Erickson made run after run, dropping depth charges and firing hedgehog motors into the water, where U-853 lay wounded on the bottom. 12 hours into the hunt, McCune ordered continued sweeps throughout the morning, still not convinced the U-boat was finished. Other destroyers arrived and spread out beyond the immediate area in case the submarine somehow broke through. Around mid-morning, 2 Navy blimps drifted over the scene from Lakehurst Naval Air Station. K-16 and K-58 deployed sonobuoys and magnetic anomaly detectors, marking suspected locations with smoke and dye flares before firing rockets and dropping more depth charges into the oil slicks below. Still, the sonar showed movement. U-853 was creeping along the bottom, her crew somehow keeping the boat operational despite hours of punishment. McCune studied the reports. The submarine was heavily damaged, her systems failing, but her pressure hull had not been breached. McCune had no choice but to order one final coup de grace attack. The 2 ships positioned themselves over the contact and began their runs, one after the other, depth charges tumbling into the water. After Moberly passed over the target, the sea erupted. Air and oil burst to the surface in a massive column, followed by debris that the after-action report cataloged as, quote, German officer's cap, believed to be that of the commanding officer of the submarine. Several emergency abandoned ship kits containing canteens, rations, and inflatable rubber life rafts. Considerable other debris, much of which had German markings. Captain Lieutenant Helmut Frömsdorf, the last Hausmensch and glory-seeking commander, was gone. After 16 hours of continuous attacks, McCune ordered the ships to break off. That same morning of May 6th, while destroyers circled the wreck site off Point Judith, the submarine rescue ship USS Penguin received orders to proceed from New London, Connecticut. The night before, her crew had thrown a party, celebrating the imminent end of the war in Europe. At 5 a.m., Shore Patrol began pounding on doors across the base, rousing hungover sailors from their beds. A U-boat had been sunk. Penguin's divers were needed to identify the wreck and search for survivors. Navy diver Clary Edwards recalled years later, quote, "Well, I thought those guys were nuts. The war's over." By afternoon, Penguin had arrived at the coordinates. Divers descended through 130 feet of water to the wreck of U-853, finding precisely what they expected: a shattered submarine and the bodies of 55 men. 2 large holes had been torn through the pressure hull, one forward of the conning tower, the other near the engine room. The divers attempted to enter through the main hatch, but found it blocked by corpses. They managed to extract one body and bring it to the surface. The victim was identified as 22-year-old seaman Herbert Hoffman. A pathologist determined he'd succumbed to injuries sustained during the depth charge attacks rather than drowning. Later that day, Clary Edwards suited up on the diving platform, preparing to descend for another recovery mission. But before he could even enter the water, the order came to stand down, as unexploded depth charges littered the seafloor around U-853, making it too dangerous to risk further dives. With this, the Navy halted all operations, and the site was marked with a warning. The remaining 54 bodies would stay with the submarine, 130 feet below the surface, and 7 nautical miles east of Block Island, Rhode Island. On May 7th, Germany's emissaries met with Allied Supreme Commander General Dwight Eisenhower to sign the instrument of unconditional surrender. The following day, May 8th, the surrender took effect. The war in Europe was officially over. U-853 was the last U-boat sunk near American waters, one of the last acts of violence in a campaign that had consumed the entire Atlantic for nearly 6 years. The Battle of the Atlantic cost the Allies an estimated 72,000 lives, more than 3,500 merchant vessels, and 175 warships. German losses were equally severe. Of roughly 40,000 men who served in U-boats during the war, nearly 30,000 never came home.